Good evening, students. Okay, let's finish up chapter 3. For some reason, my phone only lets me record so much at a time, but I'm working on a solution to this. Okay, we talked about the difference between operant conditioning and classical conditioning. They are both a form of associative learning. In classical conditioning, you associate a conditioned stimulus with an unconditioned stimulus, such as the bell with food, or a rat with a loud noise behind a baby's head. Things that a person or animal would not normally have to learn to react to get paired with things that the animal considers neutral. What was previously neutral becomes a learned or conditioned stimulus. So by comparing this conditioned stimulus with this unconditioned stimulus, you yield a conditioned response. Because eventually the conditioned stimulus, the rat or the bell, would eventually lead to the conditioned response, which would be either the drooling or the crying. So basically, the unconditioned stimulus paired with the conditioned stimulus eventually will lead through a process known as acquisition. It will lead itself to having the conditioned stimulus elicit the conditioned response. Now, operant conditioning has 4 types. This is when you're conditioning voluntary behaviors. Now, classical or Pavlovian conditioning are conditioning reflexive behaviors or automatic behaviors. Now, operant conditioning conditions voluntary behaviors or operants. Now, there's 2 types of reinforcement. Reinforcement is anything designed to increase the probability that a response will occur. Positive reinforcement involves presenting a stimulus after a response that increases the probability of that response. Praise, attention, food, sex, affection. All those are examples of positive reinforcement because you add something to the situation in order to increase the behavior. Negative reinforcement is taking something that the person doesn't like away, or avoiding something that the person doesn't like, in order to increase the behavior. An example of this is my neighbor screaming on the other end and me banging on the wall. Now, if they stop screaming, my banging on the wall behavior has been reinforced, which means that if they scream again, I'm not going to bang on the wall again. Or yelling at a telemarketer might mean they might not call again, which means my yelling behavior has been reinforced. Now, there's 2 types of escape and avoidance procedures. One is escape conditioning. This is when something's already happening and you're trying to escape or get out of it. For instance, running out of the rain in order to avoid getting wet. Avoidance conditioning is doing something to avoid something happening, such as carrying an umbrella or checking the rain every morning and the weather in order to avoid getting wet. So you're doing something to avoid something else happening to you. Some people are negatively reinforced to be shy, to avoid people being critical of them. Y'all, we are huge avoidance creatures. Procrastination is the most famous and possibly the most well-used form of negative reinforcement. Now let's talk about conditioned reinforcers. These are mostly positive reinforcement forms. Positive reinforcement, there's primary reinforcers. Stimuli that satisfy a biologically based drive like hunger, thirst, or sleep. And there's conditioned reinforcers, these things that are only valuable because they're paired with a primary reinforcer, like money, good grades. If good grades mean nothing to you, you probably wouldn't strive to get them. Let's talk about partial reinforcement schedules. Continuous, it says condition, but it's continuous reinforcement schedules. They're kind of weird, because it's kind of impossible to praise someone every single time they do something right. It's more likely to do it part of the time. For example, for a ratio or interval schedule. In this case, y'all, a ratio schedule is when you get reinforced per a certain amount of output. Interval schedule, you get reinforced for a certain amount of time you spend working. So in a ratio schedule, a certain percentage of responses receive reinforcement. An interval schedule is time-based. Now, you can have fixed ratio schedules or variable ratio schedules. A fixed schedule of reinforcement is always delivered after a constant number of responses or a fixed interval of time. A fixed ratio schedule is when reinforcement occurs only after a fixed number of responses. That's a fixed ratio schedule. If I know I get $5 for every 500 envelopes I stuff, that's not much incentive to stuff 500 envelopes, but hey, any port in a storm, right? So that happens. I predict for this amount of output, it's fixed that I'm going to get this amount of money. Fixed ratio schedule. Variable ratio schedule means you have to keep playing to win, but you're not going to win every single time. So reinforcement is provided after an average of a specific number of responses occurred. You still have to keep giving output. Slot machines. Slot machines are extremely addictive. They have you staying there for a long period of time, and they do anything to keep you playing. Fishing. You may spend the entire day with a hook in the water and not necessarily get anything. But fishing is variable ratio schedules. You have to play to win. You don't just wait by the side of the water and say, "Here, fishy, fishy, fishy." Eventually, the fish ain't gonna come to you. You have to stick your hook in the water. You have to keep trying to get the fish. You have to keep putting in your money to eventually get a payout. Fixed interval schedule means you know during a set period of time. That's what fixed means. Set period of time. Interval means period of time. Fixed means set. Interval means period of time. Reinforcement is provided for the first response after a specified period of time has elapsed. You put Jell-O in the fridge, you know in 4 hours to take the Jell-O out. Put the cookies in the oven, you know in 50 minutes you're going to get your delicious cookie reinforcement. Variable ratio schedules on the other hand is when you don't know what time you're going to get rewarded. So if you keep checking your email, you know eventually there's going to be an email in your inbox. Now that happens whether or not you check it. But they say, oh, we're going to give you a response on whether or not you got the job in a week. You best believe you're going to check that in the week. Okay. Shaping. This is the technique in which responses that are increasingly similar to the desired behavior are reinforced, step by step, until the desired behavior occurs. Now, this may not mean you give the animal full reinforcement whenever he decides to randomly do what you want him to do. This means you call the animal's attention, or you call the human being's attention, and you praise them for going closer to what you want them to do. This could involve learning how to write correctly, learning how to read correctly, learning how to dance correctly, and so on and so forth. So responses that are increasingly similar to the desired behavior are reinforced. My dog ain't gonna learn to sit. If I get her as a puppy, she ain't gonna learn to sit, first and foremost. Not right away. I have to keep pushing her butt down until she gets the idea. Eventually, when I say sit, she's gonna put her butt all the way down to the ground, but not right away. I have to keep pairing the push down butt behavior and giving her a treat. Eventually, she knows she has to sit down in order to get the treat. And I keep showing her, like, the closer she gets to the bottom, her butt to the bottom of the floor, the bigger the reinforcement she gets. If someone writes on a piece of paper their first day of learning how to write, chances are it's not going to be perfect. But if you keep encouraging the kid to stay in the lines, you might encourage the kid to stay in the lines, encourage him to dot his I's, cross his T's, encourage him to write in cursive, but doing it all correctly. And the better he gets, the more reward he gets, and the more praise he gets. That's an example of shaping. Modeling. This is also known as observational learning. This is when you acquire behavior by observing someone else perform that behavior. Punishment's a little different. There's both positive punishment and negative punishment. Now, the idea of punishment is you want to suppress a behavior. You want to prevent a behavior from happening again. So what do? This is when you have a presentation of a stimulus following a response leads to a decrease in the strength of the frequency of a response. So you can either give someone something bad or take away something good. Positive punishment is when you deliver something aversive. Negative punishment is when you deliver something, you take something that the person likes or the animal likes away. So it can involve the withdrawal of pleasurable activities, which is negative reinforcement. Remember, when I say the word negative, I want you to think to take away. So when I say negative punishment, I want you to think punishment that involves taking away something. When you hear the word positive punishment, punishment that involves something happening. So punishment is not always long-term effective. It suppresses behavior but doesn't eliminate it. It may reemerge when the prospect of punishment is gone or curtailed. So depending on how severe or how disproportionate the punishment is, you might have some emotional side effects, such as fear and aggression of the teacher. It may generalize over time, so that way that person could treat everybody else like that. Learn how to avoid punishment, but not necessarily right from wrong. There's people out there who don't know right from wrong. They simply learn how to avoid people hurting them, or learn to avoid other people noticing what they did. And if a punishment is too aggressive, you may model aggressive behaviors of the teacher. So sometimes you may not learn, you do something bad, you get something bad happening to you. Some people learn to hate their parents or may fear or fight back to the person who is harming them. I'm not saying that punishment should never happen, but it's important to do it in a way that builds a relationship between parent and child, or between manager and employee, or teacher and student. So be careful for the emotional side effects. Make sure it's effectively done. Okay, punishment has some advantages. It's essential to suppressing undesirable actions so a desirable alternative behavior may occur. Punishment works best when it's immediate, consistent, and strong enough to accomplish the desired goal of suppressing undesirable behavior. So basically, if something happens, that whoever gets in trouble should know that immediately. Timeouts tend to work really well from what I've seen, depending on how they're applied. It tends to work really well in younger children. A desire because reinforcement of an alternative behavior is impractical. So like I said, it works better when it's immediate, consistent, and strong enough to accomplish the desired goal. Taking away a gold star from his child is not going to teach a child not to spit on his classmate. But making sure that kid gets put in the corner, that might just do it. Depends on the age of the kid, though. So it works better when it's immediate and consistent. Don't wait to punish the child until you get back from vacation. Do it as soon as possible. Let's see. Let's talk about cognitive influences on learning. Now, Skinner and, well, a whole bunch of other ones, Watson and Skinner, they really believed that there was no cognitive influences on learning, that everything was simply a matter of stimulus and response. The human being didn't have a cognitive influence to speak of. Well, how does that work for learning things in a latent way? Thinking and memory processes do have a place in learning. How do you learn new material in the textbook? It doesn't happen automatically because you're reinforced to learn it. You eventually absorb the information and are able to repeat it later. Now, latent learning doesn't involve an immediately observable change in behavior. Knowing your way to work, that's not going to happen the first time around. It might take you 2-3 times to get it right. Gain directions. Now, this is kind of proven by the thought of a cognitive map. You probably have a map of how to get to school from your house, how to get to the mall from your house, how to get to work from your house, or how to get to work from school. But in order for that to happen, you have to have a map in your head as to how to get to all those places. If the mind didn't exist, chances are the cognitive map wouldn't be able to be formed. But the ability to know where you are in space is what a cognitive map is. It's an internal representation of the relationship between events or spatial elements. So I can have a map in my head of how to get home from Opelousas or how to get home from Crowley. Whew, it's a lot of driving I do. Let's talk about observational learning. This goes along the same path as what we were talking about before when it comes to cognitive maps. You need to have an internal representation of something in order for this to work. Observational learning theory is the learning process wherein an individual acquires a behavior by observing someone else performing that behavior, which is known as modeling. Now, Bandura was really big on the social learning theory. He believed that behavioral modeling influences children's development and emphasizes the role in observation and learning. We don't learn to do something or not to do something based on our own personal experiences. If that was the case, I'm sure we would have died out thousands of years ago. I kid you not. We learn a lot by watching what happens to other people. We learn from the mistakes of others, and we are very good at avoidance as a species. But how do we know what situations are correct to aggress in, or to hug, or to embrace someone? How do we know what's appropriate behavior in a social situation, a romantic situation, or even a scholarly situation? So Bandura came up with a Bobo doll experiment. Now, for those of you not familiar with the Bobo doll, it has a similar theory to it behind, to a rocking chair. For instance, it's like there's a whole bunch of sand on the bottom of the Bobo doll. It's about as tall as a man, and when you hit it, it rocks back. It kind of looks like a clown. When you hit it, it rocks back and forth on its base. It doesn't get hurt if you hit it, it just rocks back and forth. Now, in this case, a group of children see a man who is having a good time beating up on a Bobo doll. The Bobo doll just switches back and forth. It looks like he's having a good time while doing it. The Bobo doll doesn't hurt him. And the children experience frustration. They're told that they can't play with their favorite toy. They're in the situation with the Bobo doll. What do? Well, they saw an adult beat on the Bobo doll. Maybe that means they can too. Children who observed aggressive behavior were more likely to act aggressively when placed in the same situation. Especially if it's an aggressive behavior modeled by a role model. This is the role of observational learning. Bandura identified 4 key steps in observational learning. 1. Attention is drawn to a model behavior. They were told, oh, look at the guy outside beating up on the Bobo doll. We store a mental representation of that behavior in our memories. The guy who's beating up on the Bobo doll had his behavior reinforced because he enjoyed doing it. So they had a positive mental representation of that event. A specific type of situation triggers us to convert the remembered observation into actions. In a similar situation, you have a target for aggression. You've watched people get rewarded for aggressive behavior in the past. Ergo, you might be likely to aggress in that situation as well because you saw someone else, a behavioral model, do it and get reinforced for it. If our actions are reinforced, we add this behavior to our repertoire of responses. We do it, we see someone else do it, and we do it and it works. What reason would we have to think that it's wrong? I tell you, this happens again and again and again. My ex-boyfriend, man, he was really big into wrestling, WWE to be more specific. And he really liked playing wrestling with his friends and family. He had a positive mental representation of violence. He thought it was okay. He thought it was okay to wrestle with his friends. That it was okay to deal with problems by yelling at them. Or yelling at the person who he perceived as starting his problem. Because he had a positive mental representation of verbal and physical aggression. And if he was in a similar situation, he would use what he learned by watching other people. This is how aggression gets spread. Children get modeled aggression, they follow with aggression. It's almost a cultural thing by this point. In fact, it's even harder to teach kids not to hurt each other, because you have to model that behavior for those kids. Okay, guys, that's the end of this chapter. If you have any questions, you can post them in the comment section or email me. I'm always there. Good luck on your test, everybody, and I'll see you in chapter 4.